This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, and it takes guts to be an organ donor. My co-host is John Pazin, who's out for this episode, but he used to hate facial hair, but then it grew on him. Springtime is when many people are finishing up a school year and ready to take exams. We thought this was a perfect time to replay this podcast episode with a special guest, Grant Brown, to talk about how to pass the HSK, AP Chinese, and pretty much any other Chinese exam out there. This was recorded in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, but everything still applies today. So enjoy. Let's get to it. All right, hey guys. This is Jared Turner, and today I have a special co-host,
Grant Brown.
Grant, we're excited to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.
It's a special situation. You know, John, he is in Shanghai, and right now, for anyone who's listening to this podcast months down the road, China is in the middle of the coronavirus, and it's kind of shut down a lot of things, and unfortunately, John is not able to participate in this episode, so we got the next best thing. It's Grant, my man.
Thank you so much. I don't know that I qualify for that, but kind of you to say.
Well, you listeners, by the time this episode's over, you'll know that he is. But before we get into things, we have a review, and I'm going to read that for you guys. Zhang Wei, CTB, from Great Britain. He says, great motivator and learning guide. Now, this is long, guys. Here we go. I stumbled across this podcast when looking for some alternative learning materials and have been working my way through the back catalog over the past couple of weeks. The more I listen, the more I get motivated. I've been trying to learn Chinese for years, but I've noticed an upsurge in my Chinese after I started listening to this podcast. The host's enthusiasm is infectious, and their advice and encouragement is super helpful. Oh, shucks. For example, the episode on tones and pinging was a great wake-up call, and I noticed how focusing on my tones and pronunciation has improved my interactions with Chinese people so much. Before listening to this podcast series, I was trying to memorize all the strokes of all the characters in my course book. Even with the help of Scritter, it was a hard slog. Then I heard Jared and John's advice about focusing on comprehension of characters over the ability to handwrite them, and learning Chinese has become less of a slog, even enjoyable. I also love the Chinese Companion graded readers. He means Mandarin Companion. I've already read Emma, level 1. I'm looking forward to reading the other books. It's so great to read something in Chinese that doesn't feel like translation slog or bore. I actually look forward to having the chance to open my Kindle and read my graded reader like I'm reading a novel in English. And I have the added joy of seeing my Chinese fluency improve. I did try other graded readers before, but even the ones below my HSK level were too hard, and I got fed up with looking up new words all the time, and it destroyed my confidence. The Mandarin Companion book I've read has been giving me a real boost in my ability, confidence, and motivation. Thank you, Jared and John. You guys have given me such a leg up on my Chinese language learning and proficiency. 加油. All right. Well, that's really nice. You know, and I think that's actually going to be a great lead into some of the things we're going to be talking about today.
So what are we talking about today?
All right. Well, Grant, we've got you on here for a special reason because, guys, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grant. Now, Grant is a Chinese teacher, and he has a lot of experience in helping students prepare for tests, specifically the AP Chinese test. But what we're going to talk about today, it's going to relate to pretty much preparing for any Chinese test. So we're going to kick into this. Now, Grant, what I want you to first do is just tell us, like, what's your story of learning Chinese and how did you become a Chinese teacher?
So I started studying Chinese in college. I was 22. I just finished working as a carpenter's apprentice for a few years and decided to go back to school. And along the way, I started taking these Chinese history courses. And while I was studying Chinese history, you know, one of my professors was like, hey, you know, it seems like you really like this. Maybe this should be your major. I was like, yeah, I'd love that. What do I have to do? He's like, well, you got to learn to speak Chinese. I'm like, well, that's impossible. and I dropped it. I dropped the major. I stopped being a history major. And I studied Italian and dance for a little bit. And then I went to Italy and I just spent like a summer traveling around, and everywhere I went, there were Chinese people. And I was like,
really?
Man. Yeah. And one day I was out like on the beach and I met this guy who was Chinese. He didn't speak any English or any Italian. And we like hung out together and played chess and like had dinner. And afterwards I was like, man, I should really learn to speak Chinese because Chinese people are everywhere and they're really nice. Yeah. Meeting one guy.
Did the guy like invite you out to all those places?
Yeah, like we just hung out. It was like a really wonderful day. I think we're in like Sicily and we like climbed Mount Etna together. It was really fun.
That's hilarious. That's awesome. There's like this thing about like friendship. It's like in the traditional Chinese stories, it's like some of these heroes, they meet and they find there's something in common, and then like, now we're blood brothers, you know?
Absolutely. And that's what it's like. Friendship with Chinese people, there are no half measures, which is awesome. So yeah, like we like just hung out and had the greatest time. And I was like, I'm going to learn to speak Chinese. And so I went back, and the following summer, I took this summer intensive course where I was studying Chinese for 8 hours a day and doing homework all night long. And I was doing really, really good. But also, it seemed like all I was doing was memorizing characters all day long. I probably spent like 4 to 6 hours a day studying Chinese characters. Yeah, seriously. Which later, when I got to, ed school to become an educator, I started thinking about it. It's like the equivalent of somebody learning French, spending like 4 to 6 hours a day just practicing handwriting. It's not the best way to spend your time doing classes. But initially, Chinese characters is everything when you start studying Chinese, especially in a college course, because your ability to pass those character quizzes and your ability to read what happens on your chapter tests and to be able to write anything, it all comes down to memorizing those lines. And that is a major deterrent. In fact, when I started my Chinese course in the summer, when you kind of consider everybody that was in the program, there were probably like 100 people in the program all told. And I think I graduated with 2 other people.
Wow. That's a huge dropout rate.
Melissa and Med. Those are my 2 surviving classmates. Yeah. Most people didn't make it. Yeah. I think on the first day, like 6 people dropped. Because we were doing this intensive course, and we were like learning about how pinyin works, and we like learn how radicals work, and then we learn how to say like, are you a teacher? And like, no, I'm not a teacher. 我不是老师. And then they're like, okay, great. 听写. And you're like, okay. Like the next day, like we came back on a Tuesday morning, and they're like, all right, what do these characters mean? We're like, and 5 people disappeared.
Oh, wow.
So after I graduated from my BA, I decided to move to China, and I lived in Guangzhou for about 2 years before I decided that this is going to be a big part of my life. And I went back to school to learn how to be a teacher, and I got a graduate degree and a teaching license at the same time, and kind of been on this journey ever since.
That's awesome, man. I'm so happy to hear that. And so give us real quick, how did you become a teacher?
It's a kind of similarly not planned story of disaster. I wanted to get into doing import-export. And I was really convinced that I could make money by moving to Guangzhou and buying and selling diapers. And I had a friend I'd met while I was a student in China who said he was going to hook us up. And we actually did make some money, by the way. But I mean, but I needed a visa. And so, like you do, I took this job teaching English to elementary school students. And so during the day, I would run around to all these different schools in Guangzhou. And at night, I would try and buy and sell diapers and get them through customs. And I was just terrible at it. And I know that I was terrible, not only because I felt terrible, but because one day a older local Chinese teacher came up to me and said, "You are terrible."
Oh, no.
She said, "You are the worst teacher I've ever seen."
Oh, no.
And I was like, oh. She's like, "Don't worry though. I can fix it." I was like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah, we can fix this." I was like, "Okay." And during all my breaks, she made me come and watch her classes. And she just badgered me day in and day out until I got a little bit better at doing it. And you get better at teaching just by spending time doing it, but also by watching good teachers teach. And so I got really lucky. And as I got better at doing the job, it just was more and more exciting. Actually, before she talked to me, I was like, this is awful. I don't know why anybody does this. Standing in a room full of screaming children was not a fun time. But when you sort of really put your all into it, being a good teacher is a really exciting job. And so I had this experience and was able to see how complicated teaching is. I don't know why I didn't think it was complicated, but you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And that's just how things are. So after I'd had this experience of seeing how incredibly variable a classroom situation is. I mean, like, some days it rains and all the kids fall asleep, and sometimes the kids show up and like they've had like a tough day, and you're like, I don't know why it is. And you've got to kind of be able to account for all that stuff. So it's really exciting. And I was sort of really working hard at it. And I was like, teaching. I want to do this. This is exciting. And it turned out that, buying and selling diapers is actually pretty boring and kind of aggravating.
That's awesome, man. And now you've been teaching high school for a number of years. And so I think this is going to lead into our discussion here. And I'll kind of cheat out a little bit on your story. And Grant, we met first at, I think it was ACTFL conference, right?
Yeah, I think we met at ACTFL.
The American Council of Foreign Language Teachers. I was there as exhibiting for Mandarin Companion, and you were there as a Chinese teacher.
Yeah, that's right.
And so Grant came up to me first, and he's like, "Oh, I love your books. I've used your books." And so we've just been in touch ever since then. Now, the cool thing about Grant's story is that he was teaching high school, and you're preparing students for the AP Chinese test, correct?
Right.
And we were having some issues where, like, after kids going through, X many years of Chinese, they were taking the AP Chinese test, but only like half were actually passing. And then you started figuring out, hey, how to use, extensive reading and reading in the classroom. And you were able to take those students to a 100% pass rate, or your new classes to a 100% pass rate. And that's pretty significant. And so I set that stage because you're definitely a guy who's gotten some results with a lot of students. And so we're going to talk about some of the problems that students have with, preparing for tests, and what are some of these things that are really going to help them move to that level of like, hey, not just pass, but like excelling.
Absolutely. One of the big problems with lots of subjects in school, but especially with foreign language, is that, and Chinese above all of these, is that it's very, very easy to be held accountable for a small amount of material. You study for that Tingxie, you're going to memorize those 20 characters, you can write them all, you remember what they mean, and 2 days later, you've forgotten half of them. And 3 weeks later, you remember like one of them because, the characters showed up in that chapter, and then, now you're done with the mail chapter. You're on to the restaurant chapter. There's nothing about going to the post office in the restaurant chapter. How weird is that? So you just stop practicing all the things that you spent hours and hours practicing just a few weeks ago, and you get no progress. You're grinding away and nothing happens.
This reminds me of something that we had talked about once, and I think you had said, it's like you can go through all these lessons and you're progressing through the textbook or the curriculum. You're doing okay on these assessments, but it's like, you're not doing better. The students aren't doing better. The students know they're not doing better, but you don't know what to do.
Yeah, the students definitely know that they're not doing better. And in some small way, this is a little emblematic of that kind of intermediate plateau that I think a lot of students have to work through in Chinese, because I don't know if this is special to Chinese or not, but it seems like once you get to the intermediate level in Chinese, it's really easy to stall out there for a long time. You crawl up to intermediate low and you can kind of do a few things and you're like, all right, I'm great. And now I'm going to stay here for like 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the students definitely know that they're not getting better. They're not fooled. And a part of that process is the way that this thing, the forgetting curve, plays into all of this. I mean, you know all about the forgetting curve, right, Jared?
Yeah. I mean, you forget 50% of the stuff you learned like the next day or something like that.
Yeah, it has to do with not just the duration of time, but the number of times that you practice the thing that you want to remember, right? Mm-hmm. So if you just practice it one time or you practice it in one way, then within a day, you've forgotten half of it. But if you practice it a few times, then you forget much less, like maybe only forget like 20%. So like, a lot of the ways that we approach learning Chinese, especially from this textbook mentality of memorize that vocabulary list, read that chapter, perform that dialogue, that stuff just doesn't work with the way that we hold information in our heads. And our brain is very smart. It doesn't want to remember things that aren't important to us. And the only way to really communicate that importance is to make sure that you're using those things all the time. And to do that, the easiest way to do it is reading, especially if you're not in country. I mean, if you're in country, you have some more options. But if you really want to have some lively, open-ended practice, then you have to kind of dive into something that's a little thorny, a little challenging, but not too challenging. And that's where extensive reading really shines, because when you are reading something that is just easy enough, then you're able to spend lots and lots of time practicing those things over and over again in slightly different ways, and you're able to beat the forgetting curve. Otherwise, it takes a kind of maniacal personality to sit there with their shoebox of flashcards and, run through them for hours and hours a day. Although I suppose young people don't have to carry around shoeboxes of flashcards.
Well, this is a good point that also, as you're talking about, I'm thinking about stuff that's like low context. I think that's also a really big issue. I think that's one of the underlying issues we're talking about here. Because, I know people that they're like, hey, I'm using Duolingo or I'm using, Anki, and I'm going through lots of flashcards and lots of little phrases, but it's like it's low context, which means there's not a lot of context. And you said your brain doesn't like to remember things that aren't useful or not interesting. And how interesting is a single character? I mean, it's not. And you don't have a lot of context. It's one of these things where I'm sure anyone can relate to this. I mean, you can relate to this. I know I can relate to this. There's times where you have some sort of sheet or text in Chinese and you could read maybe all the characters, but you didn't know what it said.
Yeah, absolutely. And students tell me that all day long. But there's another thing that I want to come back to about what you just said. When you're thinking about low context, you're actually thinking about information poor input too, because you lose a lot in just looking at the character on a flashcard. Because when you're reading something, you see what that vocabulary word was meant to do inside of the sentence, both on a sort of meaning level, a semantic level, but also on a grammatical level. So, I mean, you could try to memorize all the individual little bits of information that are there in a Chinese character. Its tone, its any possible tone Sandy it has, its character strokes, its radical, what different collocations it has to form up different types of words, its part of speech. And that's heartbreaking. It's like so much work. There's so many things to memorize. But when you're reading something in a sentence, all that information is there. It's entailed and you're practicing it and you're using it. You don't even need to know it. You're just getting better at doing it the right way. I mean, after a while, you get to have that experience of people being like, well, why'd you say it like this instead of like this? And you're like, I don't know, but it just feels right. It feels good. That's not something that you can get from explicit instruction. And I'm not saying that explicit instruction is bad. I mean, it's definitely got its place.
Yeah, it's important. You got to have it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some, though I want to kind of take it into is a little bit about kind of some of the problems that were happening with the students that you saw. So we talked about this, maybe they knew language, they didn't know how to use it, but specifically, like, what was it about students or people you've worked with? Why are they not passing the test? What are some of those key problems that they have?
All right. So when we think about this from an assessment theory perspective, we have these things called sources of error. And error here doesn't mean like the student made a mistake. It means the test didn't tell us how good the student really was. So maybe the student has a very high level of Chinese. Maybe their proficiency is pretty complex, but the test didn't let us see that. It measured them as being weaker than they were, or stronger than they were too. That's possible. So one of these very well-known sources of error in foreign language assessment is reading speed.
Mm-hmm.
The slower you read, the worse you perform. And not just on the reading section, on the listening sections, on the writing section, anything. Any part of any proficiency-based foreign language assessment, reading speed is a limiting factor to the accuracy of the assessment for seeing how good a student really is.
I would even suggest, Grant, that even in your native language, that is going to have an impact on your ability to score high in tests. I mean, I can think about even when I was younger, taking an assessment that maybe I didn't finish all the questions. Mm-hmm. Maybe, it takes you time to read them. You're not maybe a fast reader. And then you take a little more time to think about it. And then you may not even finish the test. But
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's exacerbated even when you get into a second language and, of course, Chinese.
You're so right about that. And I think lots of people have that experience, especially if they're slower readers. But I'd say it's actually a little bit more insidious than that because the way that reading works, we get all these words into our working memory, right? And they're only going to hang around there for like a short period of time, like 30, 40 seconds tops, something I can't remember anymore. But the thing is, those sounds that you make in your head as you read the words, they hang around there. And as much as you can read in that period of time, that's how much you can think about
Yeah.
altogether. So, if you're thinking about really decoding a complex text, you have to get the context. You have to get the 上下文, right? The stuff from above and below all together to really pick up the meaning. And if you were a slow reader, you will have forgotten a lot about the top of the text. The first part could be very hazy at this point by the time you get to the end. And then you're supposed to pick out little details and you're supposed to figure out the big themes, and you don't know.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Grant. I've never really kind of thought of it in that context, but it's like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if you're reading something, go back 5 minutes. How detailed can you be about what you had read 5 minutes ago? 2 minutes ago, maybe you can remember more. 1 minute ago, 30 seconds ago, yes. But it's like, yeah, you go past a certain point, it's like you probably can't pull out a lot of detail. And if you're taking 10 minutes to read a paragraph or a page, how much
Mm-hmm.
you really going to comprehend and remember to be able to answer the questions?
Not much, right? And you could get really off base, and you could feel really frustrated too. I mean, like another kind of thing that we know about struggling readers is that they tend to use a lot of these big top-down processing strategies to help themselves understand the text, right? So they're looking at the pictures, they're thinking about what they know about how stories work, and you can't even do that if you read slow. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so if you're already a slow reader and you're not a strong reader, like your ability to use the techniques that you want to use anyway is actually reduced. So this is why these so-called lower level processing skills, the ability to really identify those characters quickly and smoothly are so important for actually demonstrating a person's real language ability and not how memory has interacted with their upper level, higher cognitive skills. Because, I mean, you can't analyze what you don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's I can't.
Yeah. Yeah. If you figure it out, please let me know, right?
And that's also about the correlation to what I've seen with different learners is that also just proficiency in general correlates with reading speed. I mean, there's those
Yeah.
two. Which one causes the other? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that, you increase your reading speed, it also will increase your just overall language proficiency. But they are correlated regardless of which causes the other. So it's like improving your reading speed does impact your listening, speaking, and writing ability.
Over the long term, that is obvious. And really, it just comes down to this question of opportunity to learn, right? If you think about two guys that sit down and in 10 minutes, I read 20 pages, and you sit down for 10 minutes and you read 5 pages, who encountered more words? So from a vocabulary perspective, it's already obvious, right? If we're thinking about learning new words, I have 4 times as much opportunity to learn than you every single session. I'm going to be growing so much faster. And the vocabulary piece is really only a tiny piece of it because we know that people from reading, they pick up lots of things. They pick up a lot of grammatical knowledge. We know that there's a lot of carryover there into their listening comprehension. And we know that the listening comprehension is going to feed back into their ability to do those interpersonal speaking skills, like, just chatting with people, the thing that a lot of people really want. So I meet people all the time and they ask me, hey, how can I learn to speak Chinese? And I'm like, learn to read. And they're like, well, I don't really want to do that. I just want to, I just want to travel around. And I'm like, no, because it's the practice that you can always do, but also because you can work with it at your own level. You can work with it if you've got the right materials, but you can work with it at your own speed and you can build up these skills that lead to other skills, which transfer to every single one of the 4 classic skills: the reading, writing, speaking, listening.
Yeah, that's funny. I just think of someone I had talked to recently. They were saying like, hey, I don't want to focus on reading. I just want to learn how to speak. Here's the email I sent to him. It's kind of funny. I said, hey, Clay, I'm going to have a heart-to-heart talk about what's happening right here, right now. Don't give up on characters. Just don't. I'm telling you. I did the exact same thing when I started learning Chinese. I thought it'd be easier to learn without them, but then I had a wise friend who mentored me, suggested I should at least try. And so I did, and I'm so glad I did.
There is this idea out there that it would be more natural to just learn it like a kid learns it. Like, they're going to speak, because kids, they learn to speak and then to listen. And I guess they learn to listen first. They listen, and then after they understand, they start speaking, and then maybe they start reading and writing. And that happens years afterwards. And everybody's like, yeah. And I'm like, you are not a baby. You're not a baby. You're not going to learn like a baby. Why are you trying to learn like a baby learns?
All right. And now we have a word from our sponsor. And our sponsor today is Mandarin Companion. Imagine that. I asked Grant what his favorite Mandarin Companion graded reader is, and it was the 60-Year Dream.
Yes, it was. Great book.
And why was that one your favorite?
Maybe just because it was so bizarre. It's so unexpected. It really pushes you to actually understand what you're reading. You're like, wait, what? What's happening?
Let's give you listeners a synopsis of the story. It's based on Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. And what happens is Zhou Shuifa. It's pre-revolution era of 1917 or so in China. There's some mysterious guy up in the mountains. He drinks some of his alcohol and puts him to sleep for 40 years. And he wakes up in post-Mao era.
Yeah.
He misses all the Mao era, right?
Yeah.
China and being industrialized and everything. So it's pretty interesting that way.
Yeah. Oh, you know what else I loved about it? All the opportunities to talk about Chinese history. Which seems totally obvious now that we mentioned it.
But, that's one of the reasons that John wanted to do this story in the first place, is because he's like, oh, Chinese teachers will love it. There's so many Chinese historical elements and contexts that we can talk about for discussion. So, hey, there you are.
Yeah. I did love it.
Well, you can go get it today on mandarincompanion.com, or you can find it on Amazon, iBooks, or wherever you get your books. So the 60-Year Dream, it's a level 1 reader, 300 basic characters. Now, relating this back down to test prep or preparing for tests, right? So what your experience is that people who are doing poorly, one thing is that they're reading slow. Reading speed was one of those big issues. What were some of these other issues that students had?
Well, they're reading slow. They encounter things that they hadn't learned in the textbook, and it totally floors them. It's like a gut punch. We all do this. Every high school teacher I know wants their kids to do well. So here are all the words that are going to be in the text. Now you're going to read the text. And now we're going to take a little test over it, and we're going to practice it. And, I'm sure that lots of smart teachers are including novel material. But with Chinese, that is very intimidating. It's very intimidating to look at a bunch of characters you don't know and have to work through it. And the only way to really do that in a way that's intelligent is to make sure that these unfamiliar characters are present in the right environment. Because, this is another one of these great Chinese learning myths that tossed around all the time. They're like, just immerse yourself. Just do it. Just jump in. And you're like, no amount of immersion is going to make those characters make sense to you.
That's right. So just use the radicals to guess that, that does work for advanced learners. And even then, you may not be right. And how do you know the tone, even if you do guess it?
Yeah, I think I've seen some studies that say that for that to really start taking off, you get some minor benefits at the point at which you've been studying Chinese for maybe 2 years. And in a college, right? Maybe 1,000 characters or something. But you're not really able to do it until you know about 3,000 to 4,000 characters.
Yeah, so that makes sense. I get that too. Right now, I can guess some characters, but it's even spotty. It's
absolutely. So they're reading slow. They're totally stopped by characters that they don't know. And the thing that's so great about extensive reading is that you can provide students these texts that allow them to encounter these unfamiliar characters, but at a manageable pace. The thing is that a lot of people, they also have this big faith in that, you're going to read it, you're going to read this authentic text because authentic is good. I don't know if you knew this, Jared.
That's that's what I'm told.
Yeah.
Authentic test for listeners, that means stuff that's written for native speakers of Chinese.
hmm Yeah, because it's real. It's like what people really want. It's going to like draw people into the culture. They're going to feel so excited. The problem is it's way too hard. So, you have a lot of teachers out there who are like, you really need to be using authentic texts. And they say, look, the kids are going to figure it out. They're going to use these context clues. They're going to know what's happening. And the research just doesn't bear that out. But to be able to learn a word from context, you need to know like 97% of the other words on the page. So if we're talking about a page in English, we're talking about, I've read maybe 5%, like a 1 in 20 chance of figuring it out. And so really the only way for that to happen is for you to just run against those same words over and over and over again. It doesn't actually sound like a very effective method until you realize that if you are reading all the time and you're encountering a paragraph every 2 or 3 minutes, that you're learning 5 or 6 new words totally implicitly every session that you sit down to read.
Yeah, that's a big point because a lot of the research that I've seen that they suggest that you need to encounter that word 10 to 20 times before it's acquired, before you start implicitly learning. But it could be 100 times or more for something that's maybe vague or the meaning is just abstract. Like we're using bay, like as a grammatical term, that honestly, I really, Grant, it's taken me, I think about 1,000 times seeing that before I'm like, okay, I think I know how to use this now. Right?
Yeah. I know what you mean about those boss structures. For me, I had to read comic books. That's where that came together for me because, comic books, it's all dialogue, right?
Yeah.
So that it's actually a pretty great way to improve your spoken Chinese because it's all people speaking. You can kind of grab all that narration and toss it aside.
There's another aspect of test prep or preparing for tests, I think that you had brought up before in an article that we worked on together, but it was about also like the endurance. And I know what this is like, man. I remember that sometimes early on studying Chinese, I get someone talking to me and man, after like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, my brain feels full. I got to go like empty it or something. But it's like, hey, when we're sitting down for some of these standardized tests for AP Chinese or HSK tests, I mean, you're sitting down like 2 hours. Like, have you ever sat down and read Chinese for even a half an hour? How about an hour? You ever had a 2-hour discussion? I mean, and some people, if they're not ready for that, they get exhausted and you shut down, your functioning is much lower and they don't have that endurance.
Absolutely. I think that many teachers would love to be able to give that experience to their students. They would love for the students to be able to read for these extended periods of time, but they feel pressure to have coverage. They got to cover that textbook and they got to move to that next chapter. They got to teach these words so that Miss So-and-so across town doesn't teach more characters than them in a semester. And that pressure is very short-sighted. Those gains are very short-sighted. Everybody looks at this and they say, look, I covered 12 chapters this year and my kids are great. And you're like, yeah, you talked about 12 chapters, but what do the kids know? What do they remember? And, that's a hard question to deal with because I feel that struggle too.
This comes back to also one of the things that I've talked about before is that sometimes there's some teachers who see that teaching equals learning, but that's not necessarily the case, right? It's just because you taught that was true, you should be able to remember everything back from history class, in 6th grade type of stuff, but we don't.
Definitely not. And I'll count myself as a guilty party to that fallacy on more than one occasion, but it's simpler than you think it is. If you want to be able to do something really well for any period of time, you have to be able to do it. And this includes mental things too. Nobody would be like, look, I'm going to run a marathon and I'm going to train by running in 10-minute increments. Nobody would do that. I mean, I don't know.
No, it doesn't work.
It's the same for performing well on these high-stakes Chinese tests. If you want to be able to give your full effort, your full attention to the task, you need to practice doing it for at least that long or maybe longer. any test that we do in English, people who do really well, a lot of us who do really well at school are or were avid readers, you know? I mean, I remember being young and curling up to a book and like, 2, 3 hours would roll by and I'd be like, oh, I guess I got to stop. And honestly, I don't know about you, but I mean, I don't, even now, having studied Chinese for many years, I don't know that I could read Chinese for 2 or 3 hours.
Could be tough.
It could be tough. And so, yeah, if you're not doing some type of extensive reading, that endurance piece, the mental fatigue piece will be another source of error, just like reading speed. It's going to be this thing where the test measures you at a much lower level than your real level. So I was going to sum up one of the reasons why everybody who wants to perform well on these proficiency tests, you need to be doing some extensive reading. You need to be reading easy stuff for long periods of time that interest you. Because if you're not reading something that's interesting, you're not going to be doing it for a long period of time. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can for a week, maybe 2 weeks, but most people aren't going to have a serious and sustained practice with something that's really dull. Which makes a lot of textbooks a challenging place to find that experience. So, I mean, we're very, very lucky to be able to live in a time where there are so many great resources for graded reading in Chinese.
So let's talk about then what you did specifically with people, with students to help them go from that, hey, I'm failing the test to like, boom, I'm like really succeeding, doing really well. And we're talking about extensive reading is a big part of what you've done, but maybe you could talk through some like specific steps, some things that you implemented and worked with on people.
Sure. The first part of it is teaching people the right way to do extensive reading, because a lot of people really hung up on this idea that they need to be reading the hardest thing that they can possibly read. So in the beginning, you work with students to figure out where their reading level actually is. Not where they hope it is, but where it really is. And to read something that's a little bit easier than their actual ability. Because this happens all the time. I teach English as a second or additional language as well. And I have students who've been very eager to learn English. I'm like, all right, show me your book from the library. And it's like, War Peace. I'm like, no. No, dude.
Yeah.
Like, I believe that you will read a page of that. I mean, I believe that you will spend hours crunching through this.
Reading a page of that.
Yeah, reading a page of that. But you will not learn from doing that.
Yeah.
And the same is definitely true in Chinese too. And it's part of the kind of the MO of a Chinese student. They're a little bit squirrely. They don't really like to listen to the teacher. I mean, we're all a little bit rebellious, a little bit ambitious.
Yeah. And this comes back to finding something below your level, because this is something you've encountered. And I know I see it all the time, is that, hey, like I know all these characters, even you know everything, right? And you actually can understand all the words, but again, your reading speed is slow. And that is a big thing, because what I've noticed is that when people are also reading slow and they're like, still maybe relatively elementary, even low intermediate level, that frequently they're still translating in their head.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things is that when you start building a certain reading speed, you stop being able to have time to translate in your head, and you start transitioning to actually breaking that habit and understanding it in Chinese. And when that starts happening, then you start kind of taking off, and your brain starts that's called automatic processing. Your brain just starts automatically processing the language, and you can just instantly understand it. You just know it and you comprehend it.
Well, I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember when I was in graduate school reading some pretty interesting studies, which indicated from eye movement studies that people who start off reading an alphabetic script, like our script in English, they kind of look at Chinese characters in the same way that they look at a text in English. And they basically just never stop doing that.
Interesting. How so?
So there's like a certain sort of pattern to the way that our eyes run across a line of text in an alphabet. And there's a different sort of pattern to the way that people graphically process a logographic script like Chinese. And people get better and better at doing it, but you kind of stay with your first script. Like we have our first language, we have a first reading script too. And it's why this process is longer and slower than we think it ought to be. You're like, but I know the words, I should be able to read them. I can identify them really quickly. But the process of reading them all requires all these subconscious processes, all these automatic processes. And some of them are definitely like, are you translating it? Are you interacting with it directly? But some of it could be just this visual graphic processing. And the only way that we know to really improve these reading speeds is to just get more practice. And the best practice is going to be the practice that is the fastest and the most fluent and the easiest and not labored, because you're trying to practice for the real thing, and the real thing means you got to go. You can't sit there and just ponder what each word means or what each sentence means. So it definitely has to be easy if you want that lower level processing piece, that like recognizing the character and having the sound show up in your brain and then having that sound lead to something meaningful, whether that's filtered through English translation or not, although certainly filtering it through English translation would slow you down. The only way to do that is by reading easy stuff. And so that's the most important piece. The second piece is you have to train people to stop using the dictionary so much, because, they're like, okay, I want to read this thing and I'm going to like stop here and make sure I know what this one means. I'm going to stop here and make sure what this one means. And that's not going to help you read any faster either. You have to pick something where you don't have to do that.
Yeah. And the other thing too is this, I think it's starting to also trust yourself, because some personalities, I have to say I'm a little bit more guilty of this, is like, I want to make sure I had it right. I might be like 60, 70% confident, but maybe I lack that last 30, 40%. So I just check the dictionary or something just to make sure. So we got to sometimes just, hey, you trust yourself, because if you're also reading something that's graded and that's simple enough, you're going to see that character again. And,
yeah, absolutely. And you have to think about what you're losing when you decide to do that, right? Because
exactly.
what you're losing is the opportunity to interact with the text as a whole, which is really how we want to interact with these texts. We don't want to be thinking about these things character by character, line by line. We want to be thinking about the big ideas. We want to enjoy the plot. We want to be able to dissect the criticism. And you can't do any of those things. You can't practice any of those things when you're stopping to wonder about what individual words mean. And the more time you spend practicing, the better you get. And then the last thing that I really encourage people to do is to give up on a book that they don't like, which is not, like I said, there's the personality of the Chinese student. They like to be right. They like the challenge. They don't like to give up. And a lot of them are like, I'm reading this book, but I hate it. I'm like, stop.
Put it down.
Put it down. Yeah.
Nobody's making you read that. Well, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if a good extensive reading program does not require that students necessarily finish reading a particular book, it just requires that they read. And especially if you're self-prepping for a test, there's definitely no requirement that you read any one particular thing. If you're not enjoying yourself, then stop doing it, because you need to be having a good time. You have to get into like one of these flow states where the practice is enjoyable, like where you want to practice, and then you start logging more practice, and the more time that you log, the better you get. The easier it gets, the more productive it becomes, and then you're really locked into the virtuous cycle. Everything gets better and better. And getting this to happen inside of a classroom, that's like a project of a few weeks. You start off by helping people with book selection. You start coaching them through this thing. You have to slowly add time to the amount of time that they spend reading, so it doesn't become a chore too early on. This is from the sort of teaching perspective, but from the test prep perspective, just getting a wide variety of things that you're interested in reading, and then finding people to be able to talk to about the thing that you've read, or being able to write with other people about it. That's where really it all comes together. because you're getting in all this new information, and getting comprehensible input is a wonderful thing, but it's not the only thing.
So this also comes back to something that John and I talk a lot about, which is really important, is finding a reason, having your motivation to read, having your motivation to learn, or just having a purpose or something that's interesting you. Because if you have an interest, that's going to drive you to go on and learn more. But without it, it just becomes like a slog and a drag, and maybe you'll pass, but it's not like a real win. You won, but at what cost?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, if you discover a love of reading and it is your purpose, then all of a sudden you're doing the thing that you actually want to do. Now, earlier I did say that some people, they're not into the idea of learning to read Chinese, which I think is a mistake, because there's so much that you can only learn about Chinese culture through reading. The literature is a huge portion of Chinese culture. And to discount that, or to be like, I'm just going to read it in translation, you're selling yourself way, way short. So,
well, this leads to something else that I also want to touch on here, is about, okay, we're talking about reading, but when we're with reading activities, that is an opportunity to do all sorts of other activities that specifically leverage your speaking and writing and listening. And so let's talk about some of those, which someone could do. If someone out there, they're preparing for the HSK test, or they have a high school student doing the AP test. Okay, you read a book or you're reading a book. What specifically can they do that's going to also help them further develop their other skills of listening, speaking, and writing?
Well, these texts, they're like a tool, right? If we're going to use these exercise metaphors, they're like weights in the gym, right? The different types of weights, they're going to let you do different types of exercises. And being able to read something just gives you something new to talk about. So for my students, sometimes we did some readers theater, sometimes we did some plays, sometimes we did book reviews, sometimes we would write sequels to some of the books that we read. Sometimes they would write little funny faux criticisms of the books. And
that's one of the things I've done with a class, because I worked on some piloting some classes before with the dual immersion program. But one of the best activities we did was like that, writing an additional chapter to the book, or rewriting the ending of the story, or you write a tangent story based on one of the characters in the book. Maybe there might not be a major character, like a minor character. Man, I had some. In fact, Grant, I think one time you sent me a story of some of the students. Some of your students wrote up
The Adventures of Xiao Hei.
Xiao Hei, yeah, from the 6-year dream. That was awesome. But yeah, you get so into it, because like if you got a story and you're enjoying that story, then it's like, hey, wow, I can like rewrite part of the story, or I write the 11th chapter. And I had students that, like, the story itself is maybe about 10,000 characters long, but I had this one student, he wrote like 1,500 characters. I mean, he'd never written anything that long before, but he had this idea, like the story, and it was funny and it was interesting, and he threw pictures in there. And it's so easy to do, because like you said, it's like a tool, something you can use to, again, practice your language in other areas.
Yeah, if you'd taken a textbook and were like, hey, do you want to read this chapter about going to see the doctor? Would you write like another 3 chapters about this? They'd be like, no,
no,
I won't.
Give me paper cuts and pour lemon juice on it, please.
Yeah, no, 老师, no. People just love stories, I think. And there's something about telling a good story. There's something about adding to a good story that really captures the attention of a lot of students. And whether you're talking about these stories or you're basically writing Chinese graded reader fanfic, although actually after we did some of this extensive reading stuff, some of my students did start writing Chinese fanfic.
Oh, did they? No way.
Yeah. They were like, hey, so we've written about the, Xiao Hei, can we write about some anime character or something? They're like, can we write like a Homestuck spinoff? And I was like, yeah, go for it, man. So
please, right? Something.
Yeah.
And something else also I've seen for speaking, I put students together one simple activity was like finding, and as anyone listening, maybe you have another person, you're studying with, well, you could maybe read books together. You can get back and you can discuss the plot. You can discuss the main character. You can always like try to guess, hey, what's going to happen in the rest of the story? One good thing, like in our Sherlock Holmes novel, you can be like, who do you think did it? What's the mystery? Where's this going? What I talk to teachers about now, Grant, and a lot of this was inspired by you, treat it like a literature class, like, English lit, in high school.
Yeah.
But instead it's in Chinese and we have a graded reader, but you have a story now and it's a basis of discussion. You can write essays, you can discuss the characters' motivations, give them a backstory, give them all sorts of stuff. I mean, the possibilities are just endless.
Absolutely endless. And good literature, good stories always brings up moral questions. I find that students are very excited to talk about what's right and what's wrong. Maybe it's something about being high school students. I don't know. But they really enjoy crunching through these things. And if you give them a thing to think about, like, how would you have done it? What should they have done? What should the consequence for these actions be? And all of a sudden, you can have some very, very lively discussions that are not so possible if you're talking about such and such character from such a textbook. I won't throw any shade on anybody.
Well, we know.
Yeah.
Integrated Chinese. All right. But anyway, so,
Wong Kong.
It's a great, and I'm glad we have that book anyway, but
yeah, it is a great book.
We need more. It's not enough. We need more. It's going on then to these discussion activities. And I'm also thinking, like, anyone listening here, if you have got just a tutor, you can even read the book and then explain it to your tutor. At least in the Mandarin Companion books, there's discussion questions, but you don't even need those. You could have some other graded readers. It doesn't really matter. Hey, you can describe it. You can discuss issues. You can say, you once again, like Grant's saying, bring up things that you think, what should they have done? Moral issues. There's so many rich opportunities for discussion. Now, Grant, I want to hear the one story though, which I thought was totally awesome, is that about the cultural aspect, because when you also get into these tests, a lot of times they want you to write or talk or something about some cultural aspect of China or Chinese or a geographic area. And you had a student that specifically encountered that, and they were able to answer that based on a graded reader.
Yeah, I had a student who read Country of the Blind from Mandarin Companion, and they were like, where's Guangxi? And I'm like, Guangxi's a pretty cool place. Let's find out all about it. And the opportunities that you get to explore things like that catch students' interest are so manifold when you're out there reading more material. And if you have a good graded reader that's introducing students to lots of little aspects of Chinese culture, eventually they're going to find something that sparks with them. And when they find something that sparks with them, they're going to go out and get it. They're going to go learn about it, and they're going to learn about it in a way that matters. I mean, it's like the history class that you were talking about. What the one thing that everybody in those history classes remembers? The thing that mattered to them. There's something that they were just so interested in. I mean, whatever it was, and all that stuff sticks. And so having a chance to read these stories about different places in China, it opens up the opportunities for students to dive into some of these places. And actually, I think that on the AP test that year, one of my students was given a question where they were like, I'm going to talk about Guangxi. And
awesome.
So yeah, it was not planned. I wasn't like, and now I'm going to learn about Guangxi. Actually, I didn't know too much about Guangxi before my student was interested in this. But, they were like, hey, what's Guangxi famous for? And I was like, noodles. I don't know.
And of China.
Next, I suppose it might be to the west, Guangdong.
Probably.
But then later, actually, I learned all these colleges started there during the Republican era and all this industry. And once you started looking into the history of Guangxi, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool.
And so what ended up happening with your classes? And I think this was really interesting because you would go a little more detail, like when you're taking classes that went from half pass to full pass. So kind of what was that experience like?
What happens is that when you take students who are studying for a test that they're pretty sure they're not going to pass, they're not very excited about studying for it. They know because they've heard from kids in other years that most of the time kids don't do well. And, there's not a lot of effort that gets put into it. But when people do start to pass and when they start enjoying the class and they start believing that they could pass, then they enjoy what they're doing more and they start working harder. And all of a sudden it just takes off. I mean, every job has its ups and downs, and teaching is no different. You can definitely have days or even years where it feels like your work is a chore. But when you're working with a group of kids that are all of a sudden deeply motivated because of the enjoyment that they have in your room, it's like all of a sudden they're teaching you. You're just along for the ride. You're riding their enthusiasm. I know that sounds like a little utopian, but it really is that way. Once it all starts to work, it's all good.
I bet it feels magical.
It is. It is magical. And you can watch as the students go from being like, I was taking Chinese so that I would have a very impressive college application, to being like, Mister, I'm going to study Chinese and I'm going to do whatever, go to law school.
And I think you told me that some of those students, when everyone was passing the AP test, like a lot more students went on to take Chinese in college because they had high proficiency, and it was kind of through extensive reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I keep in contact with a lot of my former students, especially those who decide to continue studying Chinese in college. And people think that I spent time in China. They think I studied abroad. I'm like, no. People they're like, yeah, my classmates think that I studied abroad, or that I grew up there or something. And
wow.
The reason is because they have so much fluency in reading. They're able to get so much out of the classes. They're placing really high in their Chinese college programs. And it's because they're not working through the ritual of learning. They're not sitting in class and answering questions and passing tests. They're learning to speak Chinese for real.
Wow. That's empowering. And that brings it back to even the title of this podcast, which is You Can Learn Chinese. You can learn this language. And it's always exciting when you start tasting some success and you start seeing that progress, because that carries you through on to higher levels and new opportunities that you could have never imagined.
Absolutely. And you definitely can learn Chinese. There is still this idea out there that it can't be done. And believe me, I've thought that myself. That was me dropping out of that history major. You can do it. It's all very doable. And it's so much easier today than it ever was before. Even in the early 2000s, if we thought about the amount of materials that were available, it might have been 5 or 6 books. It could have been that little.
Wow. So, Grant, I would like to kind of sum this up. What advice would you give to someone who's learning Chinese now?
You have to find a way to study every day, or nearly every day. And the only reasonable way to do that is you have to find something that is interesting, that's not too hard, something that's fun. And I think the best way to do that is to do some reading, and to do some easy reading. There's probably some other way, but if you can't satisfy those other things, you will not practice every day. People don't do things that are hard and boring and just dreadful day in, day out for weeks and months and years, because that's really what it takes to get to the highest level. You have to build a capacity to train all the time and to never stop training. And to do that, you have to find something that's excellent, a reason to keep after it. And I think that means you need to be reading books. So read a book.
Words of wisdom from a man who knows. Hey, Grant, it has been so awesome to hear from you and hear your experience. I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with me and with everyone else who's listening today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. My name is Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and my co-host is John Pazin, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, and Sinosplice.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe and share it with a friend. It helps us to reach more people and Chinese learners like you. you. You can leave us a review on iTunes or connect with us at mannercompanion.com. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for more updates and tips on learning Chinese. If you've got a story to share, we'd love to hear it. Visit our website to apply for a chance to be featured on the podcast. Looking for a fun way to level up your Chinese? Check out the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader series on Amazon, iBooks, Google Play, or wherever you get your books. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and is edited by Jasper Chua. A special thanks to our special guest, Grant Brown. Of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.